fundamentally, you've got to ask yourself, why is Eritrea a dump? Eritrea is not just a dump because it has an arbitrary government. It is a dump because it has a culture and a way of doing things and a lack of civic capacity that has impoverished it and kept it poor. Do we want to normalize that and make that the default civic and cultural norm in South London? Because that's where we're heading.
The New Statesman has got this
my favorite publication.
They have this fantastic front cover with the headline, "The Age of Deportation," and this is a quote from the piece. I'm going to be quoting from the piece throughout this interview, some of the arguments. Quote, "It is propelling us out of an age of migration and into something altogether new, an age of deportation. This exodus will mark Britain for what remains of the 21st century." Douglas, are we living in the age of deportation?
Hopefully we are. The reason I say that is because today in Britain there are between 500,000 and 1 million people in the country illegally. Now, we don't actually know how many illegal people are in the country, but it's an enormous number. In addition to that, roughly 1 in 10 people in Britain today arrived as first-generation migrants since the Brexit vote. I'm not talking about those who are here already at the time of the Brexit vote, but since the Brexit vote, about 1 in 10. It's actually 9% of the population, not quite 1 in 10 people. So clearly, we have to, I think, embrace mass deportation. Number one, we should remove from the country people who have come in illegally. Number two, I think we need to remove from the country people who came in illegally but are a net burden. Now, I'm not talking about people who've come here and retired here and are drawing down pensions. That's fair enough. But if you've come here as a young adult and you're living in the country, even if you came in legally, you're a net burden, we need to respectfully ask you to leave. Why do I say that? Well, it's about priorities. About half all the social housing in London. Think about the massive investment we as a society have made in the welfare state. We've built all this social housing. We didn't build that so that half of it could house people who've come into the country to live at public expense. We didn't create a universal credit system so that we can spend £11 billion a year paying for people who've come into the country in the past few years to not work. So I think it's not unkind to want mass deportation. It's actually unkind to want people in the country living at public expense to stay here. The good, decent, moral thing to do is to remove from the country people who are not meant to be here. What I think this article in my favorite left-wing publication, The New Statesman, hints at is that the left is finally waking up to the fact that the delusions that they've entertained as mainstream opinion for the past 30 or 40 years are coming to an end. The narrative of Britain as a successful multicultural society is coming to an end because they've overstretched it, they've overreached, they've over-exaggerated something that the mass of the population never really bought into. And they're beginning to sense the pushback. And I think it terrifies them, and it should terrify them. But I hope, like me, they will change their views on immigration. I used to buy into the orthodox opinion on immigration. At the time of the Brexit vote, when there were just under 1 million Polish people living in Britain, I was a supporter of that. I don't think there's a problem in having 900,000 Polish people living in Britain. I genuinely don't. I think immigration can work if the numbers are relatively limited, if the origin of the people coming into the country is essentially Western, and if there is an expectation of integration. But when you've reached the stage we are in Britain today, where 1 in 4 schools in England has a majority non-white British population, you can't achieve immigration, because to what are people integrating? So yes, we are in the age of mass deportation. If I had talked about mass deportation when I was a member of Parliament 10 years ago, I would have been hounded out. It is now opposition policy. Both opposition parties are in favour of it. The government says it's in favour of it. We need to get on with it. We need to respectfully and in an orderly fashion, like they're doing in America, remove from the country the 1 million or so people in the country illegally, and then address the issue of those who are in the country sponging.
But isn't it cruel to deport people who have come here to seek asylum? And this is what the argument that the author makes of this article. They started the article by talking about how an asylum seeker from Eritrea fixed the author's bicycle. And then they said this: "I feel compelled to share this story because increasingly every illegal migrant seeking asylum here is portrayed as a budding rapist to be expelled for the safety of our womenfolk or for the sake of social cohesion. We deny the existence of individuals like this gentleman who acts of kindness are doing more for our fraying social fabric than today's calls to deport people like him en masse.
In an advanced, civilized Western society, you have to agree that there are certain arbitrary standards to get into universities, arbitrary standards when taking a driving test, arbitrary standards when deciding if someone committed a crime. You don't expect people in a civilized Western society to decide things on a whim. You can't decide that someone has a valid reason to stay here because they helped fix your bike. If you applied that moral standard to the criminal justice system, perhaps you would let people off from committing crimes because they smiled at the jury. Perhaps you would not prosecute people because, as the prosecutor, you liked the cut of the suspect's jib. In a civilized society, you have to apply standards. And one of the standards that has to be applied is, has someone come into this country legally or not? And if you've not come into this country legally, or if, I think, in many cases with asylum, you don't actually have a genuine fear of persecution, you just come from a rather grubby little country and you want a better life. That is not the basis on which we should accept you. If it was the case that we should offer asylum to anyone around the world who felt that they got a raw deal from their own government, we would be the lifeboat for the world. I mean, you would have 500 million people with the right to come here. That's clearly not sustainable.
I think there was one estimate that suggested that by current asylum standards, something like 720 million people around the world would qualify for asylum in Great Britain. So presumably you don't think that we can accommodate all of those people, but do we have a moral obligation to some of them? Do we, as a rich Western nation, say, look, we should share some of this wealth, we should protect some of these people, whether it's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands?
It's an argument we've heard ad nauseum. People will say, we've got to allow everyone in Hong Kong access to come to Britain because we've got a moral responsibility to Hong Kong. I'm sorry, I don't have a moral responsibility to Hong Kong. I was born in 1971. Why do I have a moral responsibility? Now, there may be some really nice people from Hong Kong who are super smart, super culturally compatible, and we could have, like the Americans are trying to create, a visa selection system that allows them to come. Great, fine, let's have that. But the idea that we should allow everyone from Hong Kong into Britain because we have a moral obligation, or that perhaps because our forebearers once administered a part of the world, we somehow have a responsibility for that. This is pie in the sky thinking. I mean, it makes us perhaps, if we're a bishop, feel slightly more morally superior than our fellow Britons for saying these things as we munch our cornflakes, thinking that we're fulfilling some moral obligation. But stop and think about it. Think about how many parts of the world were once ruled by Britain. Do we really have a moral responsibility to allow everyone from South Sudan into the country, everyone from pretty much all of the stans, everyone from the Indian subcontinent? Come on, we don't have a moral responsibility. We absolutely don't have a moral responsibility. Why is it that we're told we in the West have a moral responsibility to allow large numbers of people from outside our culture to come and settle in our countries, but people don't play the tape round and say, hang on, why don't those countries have a moral responsibility to allow other people in? It's a sort of solipsistic moral universe in which some Western elites live, and it shows, I think, a profound naivety about the way the world works. It also shows, I think, a sort of moral bankruptcy. If you are drawing moral comfort from admitting large numbers of people to come into your country, you perhaps don't have a moral code and a moral system that is really fit for much.
And do you think that we're also forgetting the moral obligation that we have to our own people? I mean, someone like Thomas Roberts, who was stabbed to death by an illegal migrant who smuggled himself into the country in 2018, who lied about his age, went to a school with year 9, 14-year-olds, carried knives, threatened his foster mother, and then went on and killed this young Marine, this 21-year-old guy. What about the moral obligation to him? What about the moral obligation to the woman that I interviewed recently who was raped by an illegal migrant as she was walking down the street in Oxford?
What about the moral obligation to those families who lost loved ones at the Manchester Arena atrocity? Someone in the Home Office gave the family of the terrorist permission to come into this country, and they were allowed to settle here. Do we not have a moral obligation to teenage girls at Ariana Grande pop concerts? Of course we do. I think actually it shows a sort of infantilization of our political class, of the people in authorities in Britain, that they can't see this. The primary moral obligation of the British state must be to the British citizens living in Britain. You cannot be fulfilling that moral obligation if you not only allow these grotesque lapses of security, but even in a more humdrum case, you allow half of your social housing stock to be occupied by people who've just rocked up without contributing. So, I mean,
that's in London, just to
that's just London, yeah.
And that's the head of the household.
Yeah, that's just London. And there are different, to be fair, yeah, there are different ways of looking at the data, and there will be some people in that data who may have been born overseas but have worked all their working lives here. But, so, yeah, I take that. That's a good point to make. One doesn't want to exaggerate the data, but it's still a very significant number. Look, either the British state needs to wake up to the fact that its primary moral responsibility is to its own citizens, or you will get people agitating in a way that I don't think people who want a civilized, decent society would be comfortable with. I mean, sometimes people talk about the backlash. Backlashes are never pleasant. If you're in a mob, you're never the good guy. There's nothing moral about being in a mob. I'm not justifying any of that, but should we not ask, what is it that has provoked so many decent, law-abiding people to behave in ways that they shouldn't be behaving? Yes, they must take responsibility for their actions, but also I think the failure of the British state to look out for its own has to be part of the equation.
I'm going to continue quoting from the article. So the author is again talking about this Eritrean who fixed his bicycle. We need his skills, his youth, his communal spiritedness. He has his own needs too, for a home, for refuge from a state that enslaves men as forced labour, the reason why tiny Eritrea is the second most common source of illegal migrants after Afghanistan. So we actually need these people for Britain to function.
At the precise moment when AI comes along and is going to overturn many of our assumptions about automation, we do not need to import large numbers of people with low skills and problems of cultural compatibility. I don't know what the tech future is going to hold, but I strongly suspect, for example, that automation in agriculture and industry are going to mean that you can produce an awful lot of food without large numbers of foreigners picking it for you. You could be able to produce an awful lot of manufactured goods without a giant payroll. So the idea that we have to import these people. Look, if the argument is that we need labor, then let's say, okay, from where should we get that labor? Look at the labor participation rates of some of the recent arrivals from some of the stans. They're not staggeringly high. In fact, they have a very large propensity to not work. If you look at some of the data from the Netherlands, they've got much better data than in the UK. Very significant numbers of households who've come to Britain from the stans are not working in the formal labour market. So the idea that this is going to somehow fix our labour market, going to fix all our bikes, is for the birds. Now, that's not to say there aren't good, decent people who want to come here, good, decent people capable of behaving in good moral ways. But look, fundamentally, you've got to ask yourself, why is Eritrea a dump? Eritrea is not just a dump because it has an arbitrary government. It is a dump because it has a culture and a way of doing things and a lack of civic capacity that has impoverished it and kept it poor. Do we want to normalize that and make that the default civic and cultural norm in South London? Because that's where we're heading. I would say no. There is something distinctive and precious about Western culture, and we need to be very, very careful that we're selective over who we allow to come and live in the West. That's not to say we can't let some people in, but we have to be far more selective. The idea that if we open our borders, we're going to be okay because someone's going to fix all our bikes, I'm afraid that it's a ridiculous argument.
Even saying Eritrea is a dump would be very controversial to some liberals who are cultural relativists, and they'd say, look, these countries in Africa, they have their own customs and culture, and we should respect that. That's essentially equivalent to our own. And you know, if they do things that seem bizarre to us, that's just because they come from a completely different society with a completely different culture, and actually maybe it's even better culture than ours because it's this
There are people who think like you, but what do they
know?
Not
like me, but like the people I'm quoting.
Like the people who are quoting. What do they know of England who only England know? I mean, if you go and live in parts of the third world, if you go and visit the stands and spend time, as I have in the Middle East and Africa, you will realize that not all cultures are the same. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some cultures that have things about them that are admirable. Of course they do. But I don't think the idea that we have a great deal to learn culturally from Eritrea really stands up. I mean, just look at what's happened to Eritrea. They've been an independent country after a 20 or 30-year war against Ethiopia. They were finally given independence. What's happened? Did they use their independence like the United States to become a glorious republic? Or did they descend into the tyranny from which young men wish to flee? It's the idea that Eritrea is in a mess simply because of geography or the climate or because of political instability. No. It's in the mess, it's in because of the way that Eritrea works or doesn't work. You cannot import an Eritrean into England and expect him to become an Englishman, any more than you could take an Englishman and expect him to become an Eritrean. They're very, very different cultures. And people who don't know much about the world outside England, people who think that a cappuccino is the height of exotic, misunderstand. They're cultural relativists, and they don't understand the fundamental differences between different cultures.
The other argument is that it's Britain's fault that Eritrea is as it is because of colonialism, or it's France's fault, or it's the West's fault. What do you make of this?
You hear this a lot. I mean, the West, the last Western colony in Africa, I think, was probably a Portuguese colony that was disbanded in the 1970s. The idea that the West is somehow culpable for African underdevelopment. We heard a lot of this in the 60s and 70s, but it's an absurd idea. It's ridiculous. At the time that Ghana was given independence, and it was the first British colony to be given independence in Africa, at the time that Ghana was given independence, it had a per capita income roughly the same as South Korea. Today, South Korea is on its way to being, I think it's maybe about as rich as Britain is. Ghana is, I think it's fair to say, a low-income country. Africa is in the state it is because of things that have happened or failed to happen in Africa, not because of a brief interlude of European rule. I think we've allowed the left to get away with this idea that underdevelopment in Africa is caused by colonialism. And at some point fairly soon, I think we need to say, no, that just cannot be the case.
Okay, last quote from the article. They are arguing that this isn't a novel situation. Britain's always had immigrants and it's a nation of immigrants. Quote, "The multiculturalism of today's England arose out of a history genuinely rooted and centuries old. From its inception, Britishness was a composite identity formed in the aftermath of the union of England and Scotland, capable of absorbing both nations alongside the Welsh, the Irish, and the myriad of nationalities that would be absorbed and invented by the British Empire, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, and crucially, Indians." How do you respond?
I think that's nonsense. England is 1,100 years old next year, or is it this year? It's been going for a millennium and a century. And in all that time, there has been more immigration into England since the Brexit vote, a decade ago, than in all the previous millennium before that. It is the steepest of hockey sticks. The idea that we've always been multicultural is for the birds. Look how long it took for a Welsh principality in England to fuse together. Look how long it took for English identity itself to come about. I mean, there was in the Dark Ages several centuries when England wasn't England. It was Mercia, it was the East Saxons and the West Saxons. Eventually, England emerges 1,100 years ago. And there's staggeringly little immigration into England. If you look at the genetic record, England is an extraordinarily homogeneous society, right up until, well, about 1997. And in 1997, you suddenly get this growth in immigration, and it becomes exponential growth right after the Brexit vote. So right after the largest vote in Britain's history, when people voted to take back control, the elites open the borders and allow more people to come in. 6.5 million people in a decade, which is more people coming into Britain than over the previous millennium and a century. The idea that somehow we've always been a diverse melting pot, it's a ridiculous argument. But like many of the left's narratives, it is a dangerous fantasy, because if you believe that, it paves the way for you to then turn around and rewrite British history. So you then start to see the BBC making films about the past and documentaries about the past that have to justify and legitimize this fantasy narrative. And it does great harm to the country, because you end up having to denigrate your real achievements as a country, stamping out the slave trade, spreading liberties, spreading common law, spreading civilization, being the world's first country to achieve per capita GDP growth that created modernity. You have to put all of that to one side to sustain this fictional narrative of a multicultural Britain. It's not just wrong, it's demoralizing to the country, and it disorientates the country, and it creates this sense of pervading pessimism in the country. It's a profoundly toxic ideology.
It's also an attempt to argue against your policy of deportations, because if Britain's always been multicultural, then these people have every right to be here, and they're as English as you and I, and people who've been here for hundreds of years, and they can date back their family history generations. Let's talk about the politics of it, though. You talked about the fact that Britain has experienced mass migration, particularly after 2016 under Boris Johnson's government and successive Conservative governments. Do you believe the Tories now, when they say we support mass deportations, we support reducing immigration, do you believe in them this time rather than all the other times?
I do, actually, and the reason is very simple. I was wrong. I joined UKIP 10 years ago, and I used to think that immigration was an issue, but not that big an issue. And I thought we needed to control it. We had too much of it. We needed a points-based system. But I was basically an immigration optimist. I thought that immigration into Britain was a success story. Look at the Ugandan Asians. They're a genuine success story. But why are the Poles living in Britain and the Ugandan Asians living in Britain a success story? Three things. Number one, relatively small in number. Until 2016, the numbers coming in were relatively small. Secondly, they came predominantly from Western countries. Like the Ugandan Asians may not have been originally from a Western country, but they were Indian diaspora living in East Africa who came into the UK, I think with a sort of sense of being part of a British identity that was bigger than them. And I think that worked. I was, thirdly, an optimist because I think there was an expectation and a realistic chance of people integrating. If you were one of a small number of people from a different culture living in England somewhere, you basically, your kids and grandkids started to sound like everyone else's kids and grandkids. The thing would fix itself in time. And so I was basically optimistic. I think most Tories used to think like that. I no longer think like that. I think the basis of my optimism has proved mistaken and wrong-headed, if not slightly naive. So I've now changed my mind, and I think it's a good thing when people change their mind. I think Robert Jenrick and other Conservatives genuinely have changed their mind. But we need to be careful here. Everything is now in flux. The Overton window, as people say, is moving. We need to figure out where do we want to stop it? Where do we want to say the Overton window on deportation can move, but we mustn't get to the point where we want people who are successfully integrated second and third generation Britons to feel uncomfortable. And the price we pay for not having this debate honestly and openly and for being demonized for talking about it is that you leave it to people who will shift the Overton window in a direction you do not want to go. I have been demonized for changing my mind. People, fellow travelers who shared the centrist dad idea on immigration, gleefully attack me every time I say that I was wrong about immigration. But I think unless you allow the Tory party in particular, Robert Jenrick in particular, to shift his views on immigration to where the public now is and to where reality says we should be, if you don't allow that, you will see the Overton window moving in a way that it doesn't want to move. We need to say that there are people in Britain who are not ethnically English, who are not ancestrally English, but who have successfully integrated, and they mustn't feel uncomfortable. So the failure to have an honest discussion because of the tyranny of leftist thought, I think risks us ending up in a dangerous place. We need to move the Overton window, but not too far.
But the problem is that the Tories promised at every single election since 2010 that they were going to cut migration. They did the opposite. So I think it's very difficult for many people watching this to trust them again. Let's talk about reform briefly.
By the way, you're absolutely right on that.
Farage seems to have changed his mind as well on mass deportations. I interviewed him last year. He seemed to be against it. At least he said it was politically impossible. It wasn't his ambition. More recently, he has come out in favour of this mass deportation policy. I guess, is that a hopeful sign for you?
I think it is. And may I say, I think the Overton window is moving because a handful of people are asking the right questions, and I can't help noticing that the people asking the right questions in public service broadcasting aren't those who are traditionally defined as public service broadcasters, so well done to you. The Overton window is moving. It's very encouraging that Nigel has clarified his position. It's very good that Jenrick has clarified his position. I see a lot of hope for this. I suspect that going into the next election, you will see the Labour Party even claiming that they will deliver mass deportation. Now, I don't think they will. I don't think they're temperamentally set up to do so, but it's really indicative of how the window is moving. But I repeat this thing, don't move the Overton window so dramatically and chaotically that you end up being like some unpleasant country you don't want England to be.
Thank you so much, Douglas Carswell, for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.